I'll just wait a couple of minutes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chukudi Ogo. I am Turnitin's Assessment Solutions Consultant. I will be taking on this session today with a very rich topic. We're going to look at the rollout of EdTech in higher education. We're going to assess and discuss strategies for successful adoption of EdTech in higher ed. I'll just give a couple of more minutes because I can see a few more people joining the session. But while we're doing that, I'm just going to pay homage to our elders, both past and present. I would like to acknowledge the elders of the land from which I'm hosting, which is the Wurundjeri people. And I would like to pay my respect to all elders past, present, and emerging, and thank them for the opportunity to be part of this session today. I'd also like to acknowledge all the elders for all our various panelists who are joining the sessions, and especially the audience listening to this call today. As customary, it is good to begin the session by introducing my panelists. I would like to begin by introducing Mr. Eamon Bill, Associate Director, Learning Design Keep at Australia, Professor Kevin Ashford Rowe, Pro Vice Chancellor, Digital Learning, Queensland University of Technology, Dr. Ratna Selvaratnam, who is the Manager, Learning, Technologies and Innovation, Edith Cowan University, and of course, Mr. Patrick Stoddart, Senior Manager, Learning, Academic and Learning System Support, Melbourne University. Thank you for joining us today. Just to give everyone who's joining this session a bit of context to why we're looking at this topic, it has become pertinent with the current happenings around the globe, looking at the pandemic, that there has been potential and uptake of educational technology amongst different institutions. But the focus for this session is going to look at the higher educational sector. And I've put together this panelist drawing insights from learning design, managers of learning technology, and also senior leadership in universities, especially the higher ed, just to give us some ideas of what we might take into consideration when we're rolling out technologies and how we can inform better practice. So my very first question will go to Patrick. With the current climate of a pandemic, how has institutions pivoted to support staff and students with technology? And with regards to educational technology, has there been an increase in experimentation with new technology?
Thanks, Chuck. Hi, everyone. On that question, I think the first element would be there was more of an emergency and crisis response rather than a planned response certainly in the March and April timeframes. And so it was more get everything online that we didn't already have online. And then certainly for us, and I think for other institutions, there was then the race to try and move our examinations online. So it's first sort of a crisis move to course content and activities, and then onto examinations and assessments. And then following that first semester was then, and in parallel was more planning towards, okay, how are we going to do second semester if we stay in this mode? And of course, certainly down here in Melbourne, we've stayed in that mode. You can see here's my isolation beard and a bit of an isolation mullet going on, whereas we've been locked down in Melbourne. So certainly everything online. I would say there was some rapid moves around assessment technology. So certainly for ourselves, our GradeScope pilot became a GradeScope normal very quickly, along with other technologies. But I'd actually say in some ways it stalled innovative practices, as it was more an emergency move rather than a planned move.
Okay. So as part of innovation, I think my next question is going to go to Eamon. And before I talk about the next question, there's something I failed to make known to everyone. Anyone who's joining this session, please, we have the Q&A forum just at the bottom of your chats, or next to the chat. Feel free to post your questions for the panelists. And I will also encourage people to identify which of the panelists they would like to respond to the question, if that's possible. Well, all the same, we'll leave 10 minutes prior to the end of the session so that we can address this question. So my next question will go to Eamon. Patrick has just talked about the need for innovation, and based on what's happening with the pandemic, there was instances where innovation was stalled, and in some cases, new ideas came on board. What would you say, considering the need for pedagogy before technology, how can institutions support its, how can learning designers support institutions and teaching staff to ensure that EdTech enables pedagogy and informs design of courses and assessments in particular?
Yes. So, I mean, I guess it might sound a little simple, but keep the focus on the learning outcomes, I guess. Obviously, you know, really good learning design is what improves those learning outcomes rather than technology, except in maybe you know, very specific examples like the multimedia, cognitive theory of multimedia learning, something like that. But otherwise, technology is essentially a tool to enable better learning design. So I guess as long as we're always keeping the focus on the learning outcomes, then you know that kind of drives our learning design rather than the technology. And then we can assess the appropriateness of the technology against that learning outcome.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things we know in terms of education is thinking about the pedagogy before considering technology. And I think with the, if I can shed some insight, with the pandemic, that has actually enabled academics to rethink or reimagine courses as well as assessments. And also in that case, there has been an upsurge of technology to support these processes. But the most important aspect would be engaging learning designers to support assessing this technology prior to being used in courses. Just going to move a little further just to get a sense of factors that would inform successful pilot of EdTech. And the next question will go to Kevin. What are some factors EdTech should or could take into consideration when designing for implementation technology to support learning and assessments?
Well, I suppose picking up a little bit on what Eamon said before, Chagwadi, obviously the principal concern has to be, is the technology fit for purpose? So I think understanding the learning outcome and understanding what it is that you're looking to assess from that learning outcome, so how you want to teach it and how you want to assess it. So there is a pedagogical driver, but then over and above that, I think it's really important that institutionally we provide to academics as designers and deliverers of teaching and students as those accessing that learning experience with tools and systems that work first time and every time and are as seamlessly integrated as possible. So I know that it's probably a little bit less pedagogical and not quite so cool, but using phrases like making sure that systems are supported, maintained, upgraded, managed, so that academics in particular aren't constantly challenged by trying to use systems that don't work, and even more frustratingly, students don't find themselves being kicked, that the issue with their assessment is not a pedagogical one, but they just can't seem to log into something they thought they were supposed to use.
I think that's a really good point you raised there in terms of, for me, what stands out there is the level of support that's required when it comes to new technologies, and yeah, ensuring that there's an alignment with pedagogy.
I think that there's probably the other missing bit of that triangle, if you like, is at the same time making sure that staff are appropriately professionally developed in the use of those technologies and supported.
So that's professional development and with the required support that would enable them to use the technology. Got it. Right now, this next question is for you, and I'm looking to understand what the challenges are, because part of this panel is understanding what the challenges are with a rollout of a new technology. In your role as manager, learning technologies and innovation, what would you say are the challenges that EdTech would face, not just for the EdTechs, but also the institution in terms of adoption of new solutions for assessments and courses?
2 words: change fatigue. So we saw that in the move to emergency remote teaching. There was tremendous amount of goodwill and frankly, no other option than to adopt all the new ways we had to use for learning and teaching. So one way we have, I just want to pick up on what the other panelists have also said. One way we managed to really help academics through this phase is good old-fashioned at the elbow support. So we bulked up the staff support that we could offer. Of course, there was the resource creation that we needed to have, but we really added on more casual staff, including our existing team, having virtual and, when we were on campus, physical drop-in sessions. All that really, really helped, and also the just-in-time support. I remember when we were offering at our campus in Sri Lanka, because that political situation was also quite volatile, in addition to the pandemic. So when they moved online, it was really a cohort of staff within a national infrastructure where stability of connections and uptake of technology was still maturing, or is still maturing. We literally had to drop into their classes, and with Perth, it was 4 hours difference. At night, I had team colleagues in there supporting them virtually and getting them through it. And it worked. That's the good old-fashioned way of doing it. Now, in non-crisis times, as you know, Perth has been, thank God, quite lucky. Things are relatively stable, but we are still not out of the woods, obviously. We are in a position where we're looking at some major EdTech changes here. And we have a little bit more time to plan, but for various reasons, our deadline is also quite short. Now, this requires extensive consultation and buy-in, both at the academic level and even though it comes from senior management as well, a lot of buy-in from senior management, because you've got to have both, as organic as we like to be, it's got to be top-down and organic for any sort of significant change to really have effect. I hope I answered your question, Chooks.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned is when we're looking at support, it's support for the academics who are already in a situation where we suddenly have to move to a text, and also the buy-in of the senior leadership, as well as buy-in of the staff in terms of what the next steps is in terms of moving things forward. So thanks for sharing that. So I'm also curious to know, sorry?
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah, go for it.
Cannot leave the students behind. We made a very concerted effort, and actually quite extraordinarily, having even the student guild representation at the highest level of governance for new projects. Even during emergency remote teaching and now in our major transition work. And again, that sort of consultation and involvement is pretty significant, and it's really bearing fruit.
Would you also say, just piggybacking on that situation, would you also say there's been an increase in investment and interest in rethinking pedagogy and assessments with Edith Cowan? I'll say Edith Cowan in this context because that's where you're working. Would you say there's been an increase in investment and interest in rethinking pedagogy and assessment design?
Yes, in fact, we are pitching for a whole cadre of digital learning designers for 2021 and 2022 on a project basis. This is in a way unprecedented because we have I think in the sector, we have a healthy number of learning designers in our team, but we are looking at resourcing this also differently, at least on a project basis first, to make sure that the investments we want to reap in the next 2 years are well resourced.
Okay, that's really good to hear. And I see the need for more learning designers, knowing that we're in the process of rethinking how things are done pedagogically. This next question could sit very well with Patrick and Ratna, but I'd like Patrick to give his thoughts first. When we think about rolling out new technology, what would you suggest as the necessary steps for conducting successful EdTech pilots with higher education?
Well, I'd say the first thing is building on what Ratna's alluded to, but it has to be that the ownership is seen as being with the academic community. So the central units have to be just stewards. And I think that's really important. We are so in central units, we are stewards of the technology. We cannot be the owners, or else that is applied. You know, it's just technology that's done to the academics, done to the students, and that's just going to fail. So the crucial first elements has to be, this is any change to technology, whether it's innovative or changing core LMS, it has to be driven by the requirements of the community. And so these aren't IT projects. They have IT elements, they have IT aspects, they can gain from agile methodologies to implement, but the requirements have to be from the community, and the governance has to be broadly from the community as well. It can't be tokenistic governance. So working parties, project steering groups have to have the proper academic representation, whether that's making sure that's also balanced across HASS and STEM, if that's important institutionally, whether or not that's making sure there's an important student voice at the different levels. So I'd say that's absolutely crucial as the starting point for moving forward at all. And then as the community sees that it is addressing their needs, that their requirements are identified, that's when you have people will buy into the professional development, will buy into the training, the guidance, because they can see that it is addressing their needs. And I'd really say that's the crucial plank. Everything else is just sort of how much you can afford to put on project roles and project aspects to help the success, but it has to be about addressing the community's requirements first. So I'll leave it there.
Good. Right, have you got anything to add to that?
I was just in a meeting about this yesterday, and I absolutely agree with Patrick. But the other thing that we've not always had the luxury to do is take a concerted effort to generate excitement. I mean, we've all been time poor, head down, get it done, and tell the academic, thou must do this. But we've not really harnessed the interest and what you can get out of it, how exciting the whole move from learning what we did during the whole emergency remote teaching crisis happened, and what's next in store. What is this whole new world that is waiting for us? Not terribly new, but we just accelerated. So if we can find ways to champion these causes, to really make the community, the learning community, even the students feel that this is right, this is where we want to head. We probably need to hire a public relations specialist, but you know, that's pretty important.
Yeah, just a curious thought, and then this next this question will go to Eamon. I'm just curious to get, in terms of building excitement for technology or processes with the current condition we're in, how do learning designers position themselves to better support academics, and how do they build that level of excitement?
Thanks. So, yeah, I mean, I think Patrick and Ratna had a very good point there about, you know, the ownership needs to be with the academic. And I think the challenge that we have with technology, educational technology, is that it is becoming really complex, and we do have specialists now. We have, educational technologists, we have learning designers, and then we have the subject matter experts, the academics. And I think it's a big ask to expect that they are, across all of those areas, right? So I think most important, maybe going forward, is quite a collaborative approach, and where we can support academics in the adoption of a new technology and so on, is to take on a lot of that, the technical know-how, and to really make clear the advantages and the applications of the tool. So it's not something new that they have to learn and apply. We will take care of the application, as long as you can kind of provide the necessary guidance on its relevance, I guess, to that subject area or that learning outcome.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to further say to that, what I did find, so learned, is whenever I am making an argument to an academic to adopt something, I always talk about benefit to students. I think that's always an easy argument to make, and one that academics are always really receptive to. If you show that students support this approach, previous courses that have used this have got good student feedback, etc., then that's something they always like to hear. Again, though, final point, it does need to be practical as well. So obviously, academics are, particularly under the current circumstances, really under-resourced. So if you're recommending something that's difficult to implement and facilitate, I think facilitation, anything you can do to kind of ease the burden of facilitation will certainly help an academic take on board that piece of technology.
Great, thanks for sharing that. Just for anyone who's just joining the session, we're looking at the rollout of EdTech in higher education, strategies for successful pilots. One of the things that has been shared so far is that element of taking a concerted community approach to ensuring pilots or adoption is increasing, and also generating excitement. And we've also looked at how learning designers can support that approach. Another aspect of any uptake of technology in any institution is looking at the decision-making process. So the next question will go to Kevin. When we're looking at adopting a new technology in an institution, what would you say is the decision-making process? Who should be involved, and how would we put together an acceptable framework for successful adoption?
Well, I mean, I think to a large extent, that question's already been answered by Patrick and Ratna and Eamon, in that clearly we need to make sure that that it's not that those kind of technology decisions are not just informed by the academic community, but that they're actually led from within the academic community. And what I mean by that is not that we come up with a particular technology and then say, look at this, how great is it? Who wants to come along on the implementation journey with this? We really need to be in and working closely with our academic colleagues to understand what are the technologies that they're currently using, why are they using them? It's not to say that there isn't a place for us to be constantly reflecting on what new technologies might be available to help them to do their jobs better, but we need to be sharing those with them as options, as opposed to rolling things out or spinning things up, spending lots of money and then being surprised that the whole academic community is not as enamored of the shiny new tool that we spent probably hundreds of thousands on as we are. So I think clearly academics need to be central to that conversation, as do students. We need to be, I mean, Eamon touched before on student feedback and being informed by student feedback, and we probably need to be able to delve into the past experiences that students have related to us, where they've been challenged by some of the ways in which technologies may have impacted on their ability to access their learning and teaching experience, or reported positively. A really good example, a live example I can give you, is that having done our transformation of learning materials, then a bit of an assessment with students for the end of semester 1 this year. We did a little bit of a survey to get some feedback, and one of the things that the students told us overwhelmingly was that they wanted more environments in which that they could collaborate in the virtual space. So essentially what they wanted to do in the virtual space is what they do in the physical space. They wanted us to facilitate the places where they could get together and talk and unpack their assessments, and they also wanted some of those places occasionally to have a teacher in there so that there was someone that they could provide feedback from. So I think students and academic teachers, and then I think you need to make sure that you create governance processes and mechanisms that are not too unwieldy, but the role of a central unit, if you like, is to ensure that that we're facilitating. I forgot the word that Patrick used a minute ago. It was a really nice word, steward. that we're here as the stewards and the facilitators of understanding what those challenges are, bridging the gap to the technologies, and then working out how we, as seamlessly and smoothly as possible, bring those technologies into the university. And of course, we're like slow-going ocean liners. We very rarely can we respond quickly because there's lots of things to be thought about. So that means we've got to give ourselves long lead-in times and create lots and lots of spaces where these conversations and where this discourse is occurring.
Okay, thanks for sharing that and shedding some light on that. I think that gives us a little bit more context on what's involved. But I would like to go deeper in terms of your response to that question. And the next question will be, now we're looking at what the need to engage academics in the decision-making process. But how does that really occur in a university? Or better still, how does this occur? Can you walk me through a best practice that has occurred in maybe QUT and how that has actually led to a successful pilot of a new EdTech?
Okay, I don't think I'm ever going to be comfortable putting my hand up and saying something is best practice, because I think it's such an evolving and challenging space that the minute that you think you've created environments in which you're confident that you've captured the academic voice is probably the point at which you'll first start to realize that you actually haven't done that at all. So I think it's a constant endeavor. I think it's about creating a genuine culture of honesty and openness and discourse and discussion. I think that you have to establish formal and informal means, that you have governance processes and committees that you can use to genuinely take thoughts and ideas to and seek feedback. But equally, I think you have to be alive to, especially in this day and age when we're talking about technologies, using virtual and asynchronous means of creating that kind of feedback. I think you also have to be cognizant of the fact that for most, whilst educational technology is central to us and what we do, for most academics, it's just a tool that they want to work. So you've got to be respectful of the fact that it's not necessarily the single most important thing in their day, and also that when you go to have conversations with them, they probably don't talk the same language of technology and IT and pedagogy that we might. So I think you've got to shape the conversation to suit the audience, which is what teachers have been doing for millennia anyway. And I think that you have to be prepared to be open to receiving genuine feedback when the piece of technology or the pedagogical approach that you think is actually wonderful, when your colleagues and your community doesn't think the same way. You've got to be prepared to listen and understand why genuinely. And if you're going to establish that discourse, you've got to be respectful. And I think one of my observations that I would make here at QUT is, I think one of the things that we're looking to do through a number of those formal and informal means is mature the overall conversation around educational technology. So if we get this right in a couple of years' time and COVID has forced us all to the table and generated those conversations, then increasingly educational technology will be seen as something that we do with the academic and student community as opposed to doing it to them.
Great. I think we are already halfway through the session. I'm just going to pause a little bit and take one question from the Q&A. And this question will go to Ratna and Patrick. We'll start with Ratna first. The question says, what are the main deficits in our technology stack that the COVID response exposed? In concert with that, I'm assuming that means something else. In concert with that, what types of face-to-face activities suffered the most?
Two things that we had to grapple with immediately were the enabling technologies for virtual classrooms and also assessments. So we realized it was something that we were just plodding along, figuring out and all that, but it obviously accelerated with emergency remote teaching. And what suffered most was obviously the lecture. Even though the lecture is commonly agreed upon as having had its day, but we really needed to bury it in the last few months. It's come back a little bit, but it's understood, accepted, adopted that really, even by the academics and the students, that this is not going to be the way to go. So at a high level, those would be the main things.
Patrick, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, certainly. So we already had Zoom deployed broadly, but its uptake, of course, exploded in usage as soon as we moved forward. But that worked very well for most of it. We actually worked very hard to try and make sure and I think this was part of the question, our technologies were working in China as well as elsewhere. And so we did actually organize local VPN access into China and organize that very quickly and through those, and that was done very well by our business services and IT group who organized that very quickly. Aspects were also getting providing equipment such as computers and sort of 4G dongles to staff and students who didn't really have them. So a lot of students, of course, prefer to come on campus and would work in the campus and library. So providing that to everyone who needed to happen very quickly. So that was part of getting everyone on board. And for us, it was definitely the gap in assessment. We, during the course of a semester, we've been moving to a lot of digital assessment within, I'd say, the 12 weeks of the semester. That has been happening, or sort of like a blended mode of that, but not for the end of semester. The end of semester has been traditionally, we fill exhibition hall down in the center of town, 1,000-odd seats, thousands of seats across the campus. It's all sit down, invigilated exam. That needed not in 9 weeks. We had to change about 100 years of practice to fully online. That was the big change, was to do that. And for us, we couldn't. So part of this is never waste a good crisis. Okay, as a lot of people have been saying, and a lot of that was to move to not try and just shift form to an online form, but to actually say, let's look at open forms, let's look at open assessment, let's look at higher orders of Bloom's taxonomy where possible, and where people can move that quickly, they were encouraged to do so. But still, a lot of things were handwritten, for instance, are based on handwritten assignments. So to be honest, that's where a very quick move to Gradescope helped us out. We were able to do the handwritten forms, but again, it was unlooked to things that sort of disrupted that we had to manage. So for instance, everyone might have their own opinions as to the success or otherwise of the NBN, but we had students having a lot of problems just trying to upload their assignments. So these are just new areas of broader, effort that we hadn't really had to deal with, that we had to support very quickly. So I'd say the new technologies were the smallest part of it. It was actually new practices and very much new support models that had to be put in at scale. So for us, it was around, you know, like the amount of exams that had to happen, you know, and the amount of sittings for those exams. You know, you're talking about 100,000 and things like this. It's you've got to move very quickly, and that was more the issue than I would say tech adoption for that point. And sorry, the only other aspect I'd mention is it was talking about disciplines that were affected. Obviously, it was the wet lab and studio spaces. So the conservatorium, music, fine arts. So for instance, it's very hard to do music properly over Zoom, you know, or to do it collaboratively. You need the timing to be very accurate. The technology is really not there yet. Veterinary sciences and clinical practices. These are the areas that suffered. So in many ways, it did show why we still want and we still need face-to-face learning and teaching to occur, certainly in certain disciplines and certain practices. But so it's actually quite good. It has highlighted, yes, we can move online in many ways and do blended learning or online learning very well. But it has also highlighted these areas really do suffer if they cannot have face-to-face learning and teaching.
Wow, it sounds like Melbourne Uni actually had a lot to take on this year and managed to have succeeded. I want to, this question will be going to Kevin and Eamon, because I want to look at, we know that exams cannot be done currently with the pandemic in place. So I know there are talks about assessment equivalence. And so the question here is, how successful have we, or what would you say has been the success rate in the design of equivalence to exams? And how has that, what's your experience with academics rethinking how they do assessments?
You want to go first, Eamon, or do you want me to?
Sure. I'll have a go. Yeah, so let's say mixed. Yeah, exams are a real struggle, especially with some disciplines. The one, you know, anything math and stats is something that we've kind of struggled to implement exams. Obviously, there are services that allow online and vigilated exams. But one thing that we found when COVID hit was that suddenly we were in competition, because we were entirely online prior to COVID. Suddenly we're in competition for those services, and we had to share them. So we had to also find alternatives. And I think, you know, it's still ongoing. I was just having a meeting around it this morning, and we were identifying the issues as, or the key concerns as, integrity of assessments, manageable marking schedule for academics, because if you do change it from an exam, then you know, to a project or something like that, then you have to also provide academics with the time to mark those you know, those projects, and yeah, meaningful feedback as well for the students. So a couple of options. I think there are tools out there that you know, allow. I think the LMS is one I'm a big fan of. Otherwise, we have kind of take home or open book exams is one that we've you know, suggested as well. But otherwise, wherever possible, we move to a different model. So, you know, a different form of assessment. And I think ultimately that'll be the preferred model for us. And when we do that, we need to obviously address that question of the academics kind of marking schedule and capacity. And that's where, yeah, obviously having a good tool like Turnitin, you know, allowing academics to provide kind of audio feedback, things like that, having really strong rubrics is obviously really important. Yeah.
What about just before we jump, before Kevin's response, I'm just curious to hear hear your thoughts. What about the TEXA or the governing bodies when it comes to assessments? What parts do they play in how we work through assessment equivalence?
Well, for me, we work in the postgraduate space, so maybe it's a little bit different. But I did just read an article just the other day that was saying that, with the advent of COVID, obviously everybody went to the online model, and what they've seen is actually a huge reduction in exams. So those programs that we traditionally kind of assess using exams, we have moved to alternatives, and it looks like they seem to be going okay, and there doesn't seem to be too many concerns there around academic integrity. So I think, yeah, again, I think that it will accelerate that move away, I think, from the traditional exam.
Okay. Kevin?
I mean, I'll draw the same distinction that Patrick drew between assessment kind of in curriculum versus assessment at the end of the curriculum, i.e. the traditional exam block. And I think it's fair to say that we noticed the same phenomenon here that many others did, and certainly that Patrick noticed that we were successfully able to shift 500 years of academic practice almost, in the space of 5 weeks. And so if you'd have asked me in January, how long will it take to shift the university's reliance on exams at end of semester as the principal means of assessment, I would probably have said, well, it's going to take me 5 years as a minimum just to really get traction in that conversation. And if you're truly talking about meaningful cultural change, you're probably looking at another 10 years. And yet what we found was that we were able to shift that cultural practice in a very short time frame. A few observations on that. Just because we shifted doesn't mean that people won't necessarily shift back when they can. I should probably declare a particular interest in this conversation because assessment is, particularly authenticity in assessment, is an area of particular interest and research for me. And I'm always a bit troubled by a default system that says that the only way that we can assess that you have meaningfully achieved these learning outcomes is to sit you in a hall with hundreds of other people and get you to use paper and pen technology as a means of demonstrating that you've achieved those learning outcomes, when I think that, and I'm not in any way making a case to say that the exam is no longer, the face-to-face invigilated exam is no longer relevant. I believe that there are times and places where it's useful, but I don't think that it's a one-size-fits-all, and it shouldn't be. And I think that, so I think that my observation is that probably what the COVID situation enabled us to do was to actually have the conversation about alternative ways in which that end of assessment might take place, with a community of academic teachers that were motivated to be engaged in that conversation with us and explore those options, because the default option was not there to them in the same way that it had been. I think that we did a very good job in a comparatively short time frame of standing up equivalent means of assessing. I think that probably from a sector perspective, it would be interesting to go back and review what we all did and understand how equivalent actually was, because obviously there is little that's more important to the student's journey than the assessment of those learning outcomes. And I guess my final point is, I think that probably what it did was it opened a door to accrediting and professional bodies as well to start to understand that there might be other ways to assess those professional skill sets. But in fairness to them, I don't know that most of them, if you have a look at it, I'm not sure how many of them actually mandate face-to-face in situ physical assessments or exams as the only way to assess their learning outcomes. I think we fall back onto it a little bit without necessarily understanding the details. So I think what we did was open the door to a conversation, and I'm very keen to keep that door open, keep that conversation meaningfully informed, and hopefully going forward provide much more meaningful and appropriate assessment experiences for students because we've had this opportunity to respond to this crisis.
That was a very informative response there, and I think one of the things we should also take into consideration, as well as the governing bodies, is actually thinking about how to redesign assessment, not just for the sake of assessment, but like Eamon and everyone has said, is looking at assessing the learning outcomes, making it more authentic, that in a way that it reflects what students are going to be doing in the future, as well as take into consideration how they can do this, whether face-to-face or in the online space. And we've all talked about this from different angles. I'm also curious to know what the position is for institutions, and I'm assuming I'm going to call on Ratna and Patrick to shed more light on this. When there's a new, let's say there's a new EdTech in town, how does the university work with its staff to pilot a new EdTech? And is there any form of students' involvement in this process? We'll start with Patrick.
Well, we're going to start with Ratna, but she's run away.
I have this automatic light sensor that keeps going off. Patrick, you happy to start?
Oh,
sorry,
Ratna.
do you want me to start there, or?
Okay. Before I answer that question, I also wanted to add to the conversation earlier, because that was quite important in terms of how we were tackling assessments. Because one of the main things we knew we were going to bump against was academic integrity. So we consciously brought the academic community along in thinking and designing for student identity verifications in online assessments. It doesn't mean there were zero academic integrity issues, but it really minimized that bit of it. And that education is lasting. So people now know, oh, SIV, I know what's that about, and I can add it to my lingo. Now, in terms of piloting EdTech and how to bring everyone along, really, people have to have the opportunity to play. Now, they can play with the technologies virtually or in a purpose-built physical space where they can come and play with it. I know not everything is playable, but a lot of it is. And that's what EdTech can do. It can provide that element of experimentation and play, and telling people it's okay if you break it during play. That builds that confidence for people. And sandpit environments, physical locations with purpose-built equipment. That is the approach we are going to take in some of the transitions that we are considering. Again, both for students and for staff. But obviously, a lot of people like some guidance around that play and how to design that sort of guided play as well.
Patrick?
Yeah, I totally agree with Ratna in terms of the importance of the play, and it is again, it comes back to that requirements. You need to allow the academics to sort of discover and technologies and suit the pedagogy, suit the discipline needs they have, which is sometimes why we have to explain to central IT departments, why do we have 5 of a thing rather than just 1? And the reason is, well, because it allows different modes and forms of pedagogy, or it shapes better to the authenticness of an activity for a discipline. So that's always going to be a bit of a tension, because of course there's investment limits to what we can do. And we've traditionally had a bit of a thousand flowers bloom concept, and as technologies rise up, they start to request, can this now be looked at as a bit more of a supported and central technology? The main thing that's changing that though is, I think, never mind COVID, it's actually Cambridge Analytica. And post Cambridge Analytica, we have certainly seen much more student activism around their rights around data collection and privacy. And this is an issue now where we have to now put on board, we don't want to stamp out the innovation, but we do have to have very fast protocols now, and we're trying to implement those around how to quickly assess candidate technologies around this is okay to use at this level with its data collection and privacy issues. And to be able to circle that back to actually say to the students, because we do field quite a lot of requests saying, I don't want to use that technology because it says this in their data collection policy. And it's the ability to actually say, no, we've actually changed that, or we've negotiated a change, or yes, we acknowledge that's a problem with that technology. They've been very open with the students and the staff of, well, actually, we are aware that you want to use that technology, but there's actually a privacy implication here that we can't just override. So, for instance, in Victoria, the privacy requirements are quite harsh, they're quite strong, and we have to meet those. And so the idea is to try and balance those a very fast protocol to assess those needs, to allow that play to still happen as much as possible, but also to protect both the university and the students, because a lot of things are free, but if you're not paying for it, it's likely you're the product. So it's that notion of making sure an academic hasn't surrendered things they can't, such as the privacy of the university, of those students' data. So that's a sort of a new challenge that's emerged quite quickly around allowing that base level of innovation to occur.
I've got a burning question. I know we only have 8 minutes, but it's quite an exciting question. And the question is basically simple. How would an EdTech company approach an institution to run a pilot? What's the process? Should we be talking to the managers of learning and teaching first, or do we have to go to senior managers? So what's that process? I'm happy to go with Kevin.
Okay, I wonder why you might be asking this question. I think that there are probably a number of ways that you can come into the institution, if you like. So other than thinking about, is there a particular pathway or conduit or conduits in, what I would prefer to say is that that there are maybe a set of principles in play that, irrespective of the mechanism by which you seek to gain access to the institution, that those principles are adhered to. So I think that they would be things like understanding that Patrick touched on this before, there is complexity for an institution before they can just roll out an educational technology, and that includes rolling it out in some kind of partnership as a trial. And some of that is the less interesting stuff about understanding contractual obligations, understanding privacy issues, understanding integrations, and even if you're doing it as a standalone piece, understanding impact on student experience and student data and where do things go. Often where we find ourselves challenged is that a vendor might excite an academic colleague about the potential of a technology which might well be there, but they'll do that 2 days before the start of semester, or they'll look to build the dependence of an academic from their learning design on a particular technology, and then it's almost an afterthought or an assumption that if we just go and ask the university, we can plug this straight in and everything will be okay. And the reason that central areas like my own and like many of the others work closely with the academic community and with IT is because we understand that part of our role, if you like, is to talk pedagogy to IT colleagues and technology to pedagogy colleagues so that we ensure that at the heart of it, students get the best experience and that they're protected. And also, I guess, that our academic colleagues are protected as well, that they don't find themselves on the front page of a newspaper because they plugged in a technology that led them down a particular pathway, and suddenly student data has been exposed and in ways that they didn't foresee. So I suppose what I'm getting at is, irrespective of who you come in via, we at some point we need to have that pedagogical, technological conversation. Yes, led from the pedagogical perspective, but in a mature way that understands that institutions rarely can just plug things in without there being some due diligence behind it.
All right, we've got only 5 minutes, and I was really curious to get Ratna and Patrick's thought on that question, but I just want to quickly jump on the Q&A and maybe invite one of my moderators to support me with this. I can see some responses to some questions which are around products and different assessment solutions. Michael, Nick, are there any questions that I may have missed before I close out the session?
There was a question there that had kind of been touched on a little bit, is around supporting students who may be in countries that don't have access to some of the tools. For example, China, where access to some of those tools can be limited. So how have you managed to kind of work around those? And I think Patrick touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
If I could quickly touch on that one again, we did provide the VPN via Alibaba with a lot of other institutions, but I would also stress there's the technical side of it, but there's also we should be mindful of the students' concerns and working with them on particular assessments. So for instance, examples of, say, journalism students concerned about writing pieces that might be critical of their government and where they are, and whether or not that should be transmitted. Are the students at risk if that is flowed through? We've also had others where students have wanted to talk about particular data and there was restrictions on the use of data in that country. So I just wanted to stress it's we need to be very careful as the students are sort of in some of their own countries and not necessarily in Australia. The limits on sometimes academic freedom, even as a student, they may have in their countries, and that's a broader issue we should be aware of. That's not try and solve that at a technical level.
All right, we've got barely 3 minutes, and I've got a quick announcement. The next concurrent Gradescope session starts at about 1:15 Australian Eastern Daylight Time. Note that the Gradescope session with Arjun Singh, the Chief Strategist Officer for Turnitin, is a customer-only session. If you'd like to attend the Gradescope workshop and you have not registered, go to the URL that will be posted in the chat. I want to believe someone has posted it in the chat on the question in the Q&A. Finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to my panelists. I know this was sort of a quick response to be part of this. I want to say thank you for gracing us with your presence and for a very insightful discussion. We hope that everyone who's joined the session today got something out of it. And I look forward to continuing our conversations with Turnitin's user summit as we go on for the rest of the day. Be safe, everyone, and yeah, we'll see you in the next session.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thanks, Chuck. Bye all.
Thanks, everyone.